I felt this sense of urgency and the sense of panic.
He was tripping and falling so much. That's never a good sign.
I left the room because I couldn't handle it.
Everyone who approached me came in gowned and masked, and I kept asking, do you know what's wrong with me?
Next, two medical mysteries that defied the experts. Zach West is a seemingly healthy toddler until he suddenly begins to lose the ability to walk and talk. And no doctor can tell his terrified parents why.
I just remember a doctor telling me that there's so many mystery diseases out there that we may never know. And I went into I have to know mode.
Then, Janet Long has been enduring debilitating bouts of diarrhea for more than 3 decades. And just when she thinks it can't get any worse, a series of terrifying new symptoms begins to emerge.
This was something new for us and very, very scary for both of us.
I really felt that there was a possibility that I would die.
In the summer of 2000, Minneapolis natives Rochelle LeCount and her boyfriend Mike West were expecting their first child, a boy.
We found out what we were having. We had the name Zach picked out from the beginning, and I read all my books to get ready for him to come.
On August 25th of that year, Rochelle goes into labor. 8 hours later, they welcome Zach West into the world.
When he was born, the nurse was holding him, and I was almost pushing her kind of out of the way so I could count fingers and toes.
Once he came, it was smooth sailing.
Hi, Mom.
The young parents adore their seemingly perfect son. And even when they end their relationship 9 months later, Mike and Rochelle continue to share in the excitement of Zach's progress.
I think he started crawling like at 7 months and walking around 9, 10 months, and then his first words were right around 11, 12 months.
He was up and motoring around. He was good and stable.
But a few months after Zach turns 1, the young parents notice that his right eye seems to be slightly turned in.
And so we went to the doctor, and they thought it was just basically a lazy eye. And she just said he would probably need glasses.
But over the next several weeks, it becomes clear that the glasses are not helping. In fact, Zach's eye is turning in even more. On a follow-up visit to their ophthalmologist, the doctor suggests corrective surgery to fix the problem once and for all.
It was painful for us because it was the first time that basically anything was going on with him.
Though they're terrified at the idea of their child undergoing eye surgery, Mike and Rochelle believe it's the best choice for Zach.
You know that this has to be done to help him. But he came out of it really good.
By the time he's 1.5 years, the eye has healed completely, and the young parents are sure that the worst is behind them. That is, until they realize their son is no longer walking with confidence.
He used to walk like he was drunk, and I thought it was just a toddler walk.
We were wondering, is it just us, just getting a little excited, being first-time parents, and is this normal, is this not?
Just to be safe, Rochelle and Mike take Zach for a checkup with a pediatrician. But instead of reassurance, the doctor offers up an alarming theory.
She wanted to rule out muscular dystrophy because his gait was just really unbalanced.
Muscular dystrophy is a genetic disorder that over time causes the body's muscles to grow progressively weaker. While there is no cure, it can be managed with various forms of physical therapy.
I felt this sense of urgency and the sense of panic.
So she sent us to the neurologist. I was hysterical. I couldn't even breathe. It was devastating to us.
The neurologist immediately recommends performing further tests to confirm the diagnosis.
To test for muscular dystrophy, we did a muscle biopsy. At that point, there was lots of tears. I think we waited like 3 months for the results. It was a waiting game, and we actually had to keep calling the doctor. They didn't call us to tell us anything.
But when Rochelle finally gets the doctor on the phone, he does a complete about-face.
The muscle biopsy came back normal. He thought that Zach just had some difficulties with his coordination and that he would just need some physical therapy, but he'd be all right. He just did not think it was a progressive disease at all. And we were relieved. We were just thinking, okay, we can handle this.
Rochelle begins taking Zach to physical therapy once a week, hoping to get her son back on track. But as the weeks turn into months, the toddler doesn't seem to be showing any significant signs of improvement.
He'd have days and sometimes weeks in a row where things were going great, and then other days where he seemed to struggle to maintain trunk control. I always have concerns when you see a child that has developed normally to a certain point and then for some reason starts to lose those skills or show difficulty. That's never a good sign.
Zach's walking just progressively got more drunken, is the best way to describe it. And he started losing words at that point. He wasn't saying the words that he once had said. So we kind of knew something more was going on.
Desperate for answers, Rochelle takes Zach back to see the neurologist. She demands he help her understand why her son, who could once walk and talk, is continuing to slip away.
He could see that Zach was getting worse. He sent us to have an MRI of the spine and of his brain. I kept thinking it was going to get better, but in the back of our mind, we knew that we weren't in the clear.
After an anxious 24 hours, the MRI results come in, and the findings are devastating. There are clear signs of brain damage in the cerebellar region of Zach's brain. The cerebellum controls equilibrium and movement of the body, and any damage to this area can cause the brain's signals to get crossed, resulting in poor motor skills and even speech problems.
He thought that something environmental happened like the first year of his life, and that they just didn't catch it right away.
While it's impossible to say for sure, the doctor speculates that an air pollutant or toxic chemical in the local water could have unknowingly caused the damage.
The neurologist didn't think it was going to get much worse, that it was just his skills that needed help with. So we held on to that. We left there going, he's going to get better.
The doctor recommends that Zach continue with regular physical therapy in the hope that in time he'll begin to regain his strength and coordination.
We went to physical therapy one time a week. He actually loved it because they played with him. They worked to try to get him balanced and walking a straight line. We were trying to do everything just to make him progress.
It seemed to take him a lot more energy to do some of the things we wanted him to do than it would take the typical child.
For a while, it seemed like Zach was stabilizing, and then he just, again, progressively had a harder time walking, harder time with trunk control and hand control and that kind of stuff.
The pattern is becoming all too familiar, and when Zach is almost 3, Rochelle and Mike decide to get another opinion, this time from a specialist at a well-respected hospital several hours away.
At that hospital, they work as teams. That made me feel better to say, great, now we got more than just one person interpreting, and maybe they can do some brainstorming.
Rochelle and Mike eagerly hand over Zach's hefty file to the team's lead neurologist, hopeful that they'll finally get some answers.
She had a couple things in her head, and we did blood work and a urine test. And then she said, if for whatever reason I need you back here, I'll call you. And it was like 3 days later, we got a phone call that we needed to come right away. So we're like, it's something. They figured him out, and we just were not prepared for the answer that she gave us when we were down there.
In 1970, Janet Long was a carefree 11-year-old, living a seemingly idyllic childhood on the plains of Nebraska.
I grew up in the Midwest and had a pretty happy childhood, and I played a lot outside with my friends.
But when young Janet gets her first period in the fall of that year, she is completely unprepared for her body's dramatic reaction.
I would have excruciating stomach pain, and I wouldn't be able to go to school for a day or two.
Her mother assures her that the agonizing cramps are just a part of growing up.
Back in those days, there wasn't much she could do for me except give me a couple baby aspirin and a hot water bottle.
But when Janet enters high school, new and very embarrassing symptoms begin to emerge.
At that point, I would also have occasional times of diarrhea and vomiting. I figured I was just a girl who was having a really tough time every month, and that was probably what every girl went through.
Over the years, Janet learns to endure the severe monthly episodes and manages to make it through high school without anyone catching on. But during her first semester at college, the crippling attacks begin to intensify, and she can no longer keep the disturbing symptoms to herself.
And I can remember calling my parents and saying, this just is much harder than what I've ever had before.
At her parents' urging, she schedules an appointment with a university doctor. He performs a thorough head-to-toe exam, but when he can't find anything wrong, the doctor concludes that the attacks must have simply been triggered by a bad case of college stress.
I think my mother and I both came to the conclusion that I was indeed just having stomach trouble from tension. So we just thought that that was just something I was going to have to deal with, and pretty much that's what I did.
Each day is a challenge for Janet as she scopes out the closest bathrooms and struggles to hide the humiliating episodes.
I continued to have severe stomach pain, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea.
But one night, it becomes impossible for Janet to hide the painful attacks any longer.
At one point, I went out to eat with my friends, came home and didn't feel well, and thought, well, it must be something I ate. And in about 3 hours, I would guess, from that time, I was literally crawling on the floor.
Writhing in pain, Janet spends hours locked in the bathroom. She's never experienced an attack this intense.
By that night, I was having severe diarrhea and realized that there was blood in the toilet.
In a state of panic, Janet realizes that she has to get help fast. She calls for her roommate, who rushes her to the nearest emergency room.
By that time, I had lost a lot of blood and was quite weak.
After listening to Janet describe the sudden violent attack, the ER doctors fear that she may have contracted a highly contagious intestinal virus. They immediately order Janet into quarantine to prevent her from infecting anyone else.
It was very scary for me. Everyone who approached me came in gowned and masked, and I kept asking, do you know what's wrong with me? And no one was really answering my questions.
The problem is that the experts are just as confused as she is. They quickly rule out an infection, then begin running a slew of tests in an attempt to figure out what could be causing her to bleed internally.
I had colonoscopies, all kinds of ultrasounds, all kinds of x-rays, barium exams, dye exams, and each one of those was really excruciatingly painful.
Finally, 3 days later, the doctors have a theory. It appears that Janet may be suffering from a rare condition called Meckel's diverticulum. Essentially, it is a bulge the size of an adult thumb on the interior wall of the small intestine. This abnormal growth must be removed before it blocks her intestine and causes potentially fatal bleeding. The only course of action is immediate surgery.
I was very unnerved, I think, mostly because of the bleeding. I had never had bleeding before, and that was frightening to me. I really felt that there was a possibility that I would die.
Over the past year and a half, 3-year-old Zach West has been slowly losing the ability to walk and talk. But at last, a team of doctors more than 200 miles away believes they've found a critical clue.
We got a phone call and we drove down there right away.
But as the family walks into the doctor's office, they immediately sense that the news is not good. The neurologist explains that this seemingly simple urine test was positive for a tumor marker.
It was like, he has cancer. You know, that was the last thing that we ever thought it could be.
In fact, the team suspects that Zach has a neuroblastoma, a cancer that forms in nerve tissue. This has most likely been causing his steady muscular decline. The worst cases often result in paralysis.
It was tough because you're like, please let it be this, so that way at least we have a cure. And then that way at least we know what it is, so we know what we can do.
While the team is confident that a tumor is causing Zach's body to slowly shut down, they need to locate it before coming up with a treatment plan.
Usually the neuroblastoma tumor is found in the chest cavity, so they thought that they would do the scans and be able to pinpoint right where it is. And she had test after test ready for us. He had a CAT scan. It was horrible. He had to be awake for it, and they pretty much tied him down, and he just lost it. He freaked out. I left the room because I couldn't handle it, and his dad stayed in there with him and held him down.
It's instinct, you know, I want to protect him, especially when he's that helpless, but now they're asking me to participate with them. It was breaking my heart.
But this becomes just one of countless scans that Zach is forced to endure over the next 12 weeks. And each one comes back inconclusive.
The neurologist really thought there has to be a tumor somewhere. But the oncologist wasn't at the same place. He was like, I don't think he has this. So we had two different conflicting doctors at the same clinic saying, yes, he has it, or no, he doesn't have it.
Overwhelmed and exhausted, Rochelle and Mike demand to know how the medical team could be so certain that Zach had a tumor just 3 months earlier and be so unsure of that diagnosis today.
The neurologist down there researched it, and there's a regression of neuroblastomas that can happen spontaneously. And so she thought that's what had happened to Zach.
That was pretty much the end of it. That was the end of the contact. Okay, well, we did what we thought we could do. See you, bye. You're stressed to the max. But again, I felt it was my role not to get upset. Basically, when I was alone, yeah, then it'd crawl up on me, and then, you know, I'd sit there and I'd have a good cry.
There was so many tears, but I needed to make sure that he was living the best life, and I was doing everything I could, no stone left unturned, to make sure that he was gonna be okay.
Not knowing where else to turn, Mike and Rochelle go back to the one person who has actually helped Zach in the past, his physical therapist, Vicki Miles.
He was tripping and falling so much. We were really trying as hard as we could to keep him upright and walking and moving. That was really important to Mom and Dad both.
It was frustrating because he couldn't get to the point where he wanted to go. And there would be times where he would just drop to the floor and just start crawling because he just didn't have the energy to do it anymore.
We did give him a walker to give him a little bit of additional support and see if we could keep him safe. That worked for a while.
I was trying to take video of how bad his walking had gotten at that point, and I was backing away from him. And I think that was probably 2 months before he completely just stopped walking. So that was one of the last videos I have of him walking ever.
It's hard to see that backwards progression. It went from walking to being very wobbly walking to getting to the point where he couldn't walk.
His therapist finally just said, we have to get a wheelchair for him.
By August of 2004, Zach is almost 4 years old, and he's stopped walking altogether. Crushed, Rochelle and Mike begin taking him to a new round of specialists, but none can shed any light on Zach's ongoing deterioration.
I just remember a doctor telling me that there's so many mystery diseases out there that we may never know. And I went into I have to know mode.
During a violent attack of diarrhea and vomiting, Janet Long has been admitted to the hospital. She's bleeding internally and is on her way into surgery to remove what doctors believe is a blockage in her small intestine.
I was by myself, and it just felt like things were not going to come to a good end.
But after 4 intense hours in the OR, the doctors are shocked by what they find. There is no evidence of any blockage or bleeding in Janet's abdomen whatsoever. Baffled, they immediately call off the surgery.
After I came out of the surgery, they told me that they couldn't find anything in my abdomen that was unusual.
While she's relieved that the bleeding has stopped, Janet is having a hard time understanding why no doctor can explain what's going on.
I asked, what are the chances this is going to happen again? And I was told, well, we really don't know. We really can't tell you.
Dumbfounded by the disturbing turn of events, Janet is discharged. And within 2 weeks, the brutal symptoms return with a vengeance.
And I was planning on it eventually just completely clearing up, but that didn't happen.
But Janet is determined to take back control of her life and does her best to ride out the painful episodes whenever they strike. Then, when she least expects it, she meets Matthew Long.
Jen and I hit it off from the start. I have always enjoyed her company. She's a pleasure to be with.
Still horrified by the embarrassing attacks, Janet works hard to conceal her condition from Matthew.
I really felt that it was my struggle and it was mine to get through.
I had no idea how serious her symptoms were, none at all.
But when Matthew proposes in 1986, Janet knows that she has to reveal her dark secret to the man she's going to marry.
When she first told me about her sickness, she told me that it was chronic, it wasn't going away.
And he was very sweet and said, "That's all right. I want to marry you," and in sickness and in health. So we were married that October.
Over the course of the next 2 years, the unpredictable attacks continue to torment her. But every doctor she checks in with insists that there's nothing clinically wrong with her. Then, in 1988, the Longs get a surprise when they discover that Janet is pregnant. It's an exhilarating moment for the young couple, but they also worry about her ability to cope with the rigors of a 9-month pregnancy.
I remember when Jan told me she was pregnant. I remember quite clearly the excitement of it all and the apprehension of it all at the same time.
But the couple is shocked when the first trimester turns out to be far easier than either of them ever expected.
I remember saying to my husband, "Boy, I haven't felt this good in a long time. If this is what pregnancy does to you, I want to be pregnant all the time." So I thought, well, maybe pregnancy has cured me.
But 9 months later, right after their daughter Anna is born, the harrowing attacks return almost overnight.
I can remember there were times when I would have her in my arms and be trying to take care of her or even nurse her while I was sitting on the toilet. I had no choice.
Distraught, Janet finds herself back to square one, searching for answers.
Jan went to a number of doctors, and that was extremely frustrating for her.
I couldn't understand why I'd seen so many doctors, and yet there wasn't anyone who could come up with something that, if it wasn't a diagnosis, at least with some kind of treatment that would make me feel better.
As painful as the attacks are, the doctors don't believe they pose a major health threat. So Janet just continues to grin and bear it. Then she finds out that she's pregnant again.
I was excited, thinking, wow, this is great, and pregnancy cures it all. It's going to be fabulous. And probably about halfway through that pregnancy, I just got really sick and went right back to the nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. I went back again to the gastroenterologists, but they really couldn't give me an answer. And eventually, after so many times of going to see a doctor and they can't tell you what's wrong with you, you tend to give up going to the doctor.
But the real struggle is yet to come. When her second daughter, Jenna, is born, Janet is suddenly faced with the prospect of taking care of a newborn and a toddler all at once. It is worse than she could have ever imagined.
She'd disappear into the bathroom, be there for extended periods of time.
But as difficult as it is for Matthew to watch, he can't convince Janet to go back to the doctor.
There were a few times when I would ask her if it's time to go to the emergency room, and she was very reluctant to do so.
And when she gets pregnant a third time, Janet begins to worry that the incessant attacks could be threatening the life of her baby.
My most vivid memory is being pregnant and just vomiting, just hours and hours. And I thought something was wrong with the baby.
Scared stiff, Matthew rushes Janet to the closest emergency room.
I just was curled up in the back seat trying to get there, and I just felt that it was the end.
For more than 2 years, Zach West's parents have watched him slowly lose the ability to walk. And when no doctor can explain what's causing his shocking decline, his mother takes matters into her own hands.
I would do a ton of researching, and I just wouldn't stop. It was like a roller coaster, because then I'd be like, I can't put Zach through this anymore.
But eventually, Rochelle tracks down a doctor in Illinois who specializes in extremely rare disorders, and he agrees to see them. After thoroughly reviewing their son's history, he suggests a test that Zach has not yet undergone, a spinal tap.
At that point, my hopes are up once again that we are going to be able to help him and find a cure for him.
For a week, they wait, and when the findings come in, they get the first glimmer of an answer.
The spinal tap showed that he had elevated T cells.
The doctor explains that T cells help maintain the body's immune system. Any change in the T cell levels could indicate that Zach is suffering from an autoimmune disease, a disorder in which the body essentially attacks itself.
He just said that he thinks that he has an autoimmune disease, but he doesn't know specifics.
He goes on to explain that autoimmune diseases can be either inherited or acquired, but without being able to pinpoint the exact cause of Zach's immune reaction, it's impossible to determine if, in fact, it triggered his decline.
He said we could go home and try this IVIG therapy, and if it's an autoimmune disease, it will help Zach.
IVIG therapy, or intravenous immunoglobulin therapy, boosts the body's natural response to infection.
The whole ride home, it was about a 6-hour drive. I think I cried the whole way, just because it wasn't the trip that I thought it was going to be. I thought I was going there for that magic answer and cure for him.
The young parents realize that the IVIG is essentially a shot in the dark. There is no guarantee that it will work. But with their options dwindling, they ultimately decide to go ahead with the therapy.
We do the infusion every 28 days, and he would go in there and he would be really wobbly. By the second bottle, Zach perks up and you can just tell he feels better. So we were like, he has an autoimmune issue. We're gonna be okay again.
For the next 2 years, Zach receives the IVIG therapy every few weeks. Though it's not a cure, the treatment does appear to be slowing the progression of the disease.
We just did what we had to do to keep Zach okay, and I really wasn't researching on the internet because Zach had a diagnosis.
For the first time in 5 years, Rochelle and Mike find themselves coming to terms with their son's condition. Little do they know that their world is about to be turned completely upside down.
In April of 2007, we did another MRI. And they came in like the cavalry. I just said, uh-oh, you know, something's wrong. And I remember she asked me if I was in a good place. And I instantly, start crying because I'm like, what is she gonna tell me? So she told me that his MRI came back and there was a big change and that he had iron deposits on his brain.
This was the first really big, specific finding that pointed them in a specific direction.
She goes, I think he has this PKAN disease. And I said, are you sure? And she goes, I'm never 100%, but I'm 99% sure.
PKAN, or pantothenate kinase-associated neurodegeneration, affects the nervous system and is characterized by muscle rigidity and weakness. An MRI will show an abnormal buildup of iron in specific regions of the brain. It's a very rare progressive disease with no known treatment.
I went home and I looked online and I was like, this just doesn't make sense. It didn't look like Zach. The symptoms didn't look like Zach. I Googled brain iron accumulation just to see if there's anything else. And I came across this one website that had this other disease on it. And I about fell off my chair because every little thing was what Zach had.
After suffering through more than 6 hours of violent diarrhea and vomiting, Janet Long's husband is rushing her to the closest emergency room. She's in the 3rd trimester of her pregnancy.
My biggest concern was that the baby was all right.
As a first step, the ER doctor performs an ultrasound to see what's going on. Immediately, it's clear that there's a strange and alarming fluid surrounding her womb.
And I said, well, what would cause that? And he said, well, I really can't tell you. I have no idea.
Suddenly, the young parents are terrified that they could lose their child.
During that time in the emergency room with Jan, I was very scared. This was something new for us and very, very scary for both of us.
But as soon as their doctor arrives and reviews Janet's charts, she gives them the news they've been so desperate to hear.
And she came in and said, the baby's fine. I was very happy that the baby was all right. That was my biggest concern. But I really wondered, why was there fluid all through my abdomen? And I was surprised that no one could tell me.
But while the experts are trying to figure out exactly what's going on, the strange fluid vanishes almost as quickly as it appeared.
And the doctors said, well, it looks like you're getting better. Why don't you go home?
Outraged by the doctor's dismissal, Janet finally decides to take matters into her own hands.
I can remember thinking I have to find a specialist if I'm going to get an answer.
In less than 24 hours, Janet manages to track down Dr. Jacqueline Wolfe, a highly respected gastroenterologist in Boston.
When Janet came to see me, she was very scared. She had fluid in her abdomen, and we don't usually see that in pregnancy unless something else is going on. I examined from her head down to the bottom of her neck, which was totally normal. Then I looked carefully at her abdomen because this is the place that she was having her complaints. And I examined her to make sure she didn't have tenderness, and everything in her belly was normal. Her symptoms and her history was very unusual.
In fact, Dr. Wolf has never seen anything like Janet's case before.
I thought Janet had something, but I didn't know what it was.
Completely discouraged, Janet heads home, wondering if anyone will ever be able to crack her case.
I had very little confidence that anyone was ever going to figure out what was wrong with me.
2 months after the alarming episode, Matthew and Janet's third daughter, Kaisa, is born healthy, but Janet is feeling worse than ever.
After Kaisa was born, the frequency of the attacks continued to increase, and Jan would spend more time in the bathroom.
It's a difficult time for Janet as she struggles to manage 3 children alongside seemingly endless trips to the bathroom. Then, when she least expects it, a strange new symptom emerges.
My hands would get red and itchy, and then they would start to swell. If I got down on my hands and knees to wash the floor, the motion of pushing on the floor with the sponge would make my hand swell, and the swelling would go from my hand into my arm and from my arm up into my shoulder.
Disturbed by the mysterious swelling, Matthew insists that Janet check in with a family physician.
We went to the doctor and I explained to them, and they said, oh, it's probably allergic. You'll just have to watch what you use for soap, and sent me back home.
Janet tries experimenting with various detergents and other cleaning products, but the swelling seems to take on a life of its own.
They got worse. The patches, the blotches, the swelling got worse.
On her last leg, Janet begins spending more and more time isolated in the house with the children.
At times when we were really young, my mom would be in the bathroom trying to keep herself together. Me and my younger sister, we would be playing around while my mom had bigger things on her mind.
It was just when she was sick. She was very sick.
A lot of times I would lay on the couch beside them and just watch them play so that I could at least know they were safe and be near them.
For the sake of her daughters, Janet decides her only choice is to fight back.
I wanted to live for my 3 girls. I wanted to get better, and I think that was finally enough to get me to try one more time.
She starts by calling the only doctor who has ever seemed interested in solving her case, Dr. Jacqueline Wolf.
Janet came back again with the same symptoms, and we went through the same thing again. The abdominal pain, the vomiting, the burning in her belly. And I was just trying to find something else.
And as she went to walk out the door, she turned back around and she said, is there anything else, anything at all that you haven't told me that maybe I should know? And I said, well, there's these weird swelling things that I have, but the doctor tells me that it's allergies.
So on hearing this, I'm thinking now, well, this is connected. This is connected to what Janet has.
And it was like a light bulb went off over her head, and she looked at me and she said, I think I know what you have.
Over the course of the past 5 years, Rochelle LeCount and Mike West have watched their son Zach slowly regress. Once a vibrant and active child, he's now barely able to move around. And while more than 24 doctors have failed to explain Zach's deterioration, Rochelle has just discovered a lead online.
I found that they just started testing for the gene that causes this disease. I wanted to know more, and I needed to hear from the expert.
Her next call is to Dr. Susan Hayflick, one of the leading experts in a disease that was identified just 2 years ago.
The sense I got was that Rochelle was, I think, very obviously striking that critical balance between dogging getting a diagnosis and taking really good care of her child.
Dr. Hayflick agrees with Rochelle that Zach has many of the classic symptoms of this extremely rare disease. In fact, it is so rare there are less than 10 known cases worldwide.
We are one of the world's centers for these disorders. All the cases in the U.S. tend to funnel towards us.
Dr. Hayflick assures Rochelle that a simple DNA test is all she needs to make the diagnosis. But the family will have to wait an agonizing 2 months for the results.
We've been told so many things that I think I wasn't going to believe anything. I just wanted confirmation.
My recollection in Zach's situation was having a very high level of confidence that a mutation would be found. And in fact, he has what we would call an atypical neuroaxonal dystrophy.
Atypical neuroaxonal dystrophy is a genetic neuromuscular degenerative disorder that essentially cripples the nervous system. It's characterized by a buildup of toxic substances in the nerve endings, known as axonal spheroids, that gradually leads to a progressive decline in a patient's muscular control and ultimately loss of vision.
I knew 100%. Now we can figure out what we're fighting. I'd rather know than not know.
We don't know specifically how it causes the nerve death, but nerves have anatomy. There's the wiring that goes from one nerve to another nerve to transmit a signal. That's what's happening with the nerves. They're getting bunged up with stuff, and they're not able to transmit the signal in an efficient way. It's clear that whatever is causing the accumulation of this junk is the very process of what's killing the nerves. And the reason why kids with atypical NAD have muscle weakness is that the nerves to the muscles are dying. Kids like Zach have global regression of their development. It's not in any one area, it's across the board.
Dr. Hayflick further suspects that Zach's lazy eye was the initial sign of the disorder.
We can see that the optic nerve or the wiring from the eye to the back of the brain is deteriorating. It's called optic atrophy, and that's seen in a lot of neurologic disorders. The nerve death is the more generalized process that we're seeing in the MRI changes that he showed in the cerebellum.
But the iron accumulation that the neurologist found on Zach's brain is harder to explain.
The iron accumulation is more of a clue at this stage to get us to a diagnosis. We don't know why it accumulates.
And to confuse matters even more, Zach also seems to be suffering from a peculiar autoimmune disorder that is not generally found in patients with NAD.
One of the things that was striking to me in this encounter was Zachary has some features that are pretty unusual. He's got this immune abnormality that hasn't been described before in other kids. Zach has already shown us in a number of ways that he's different, even from other kids with atypical NAD.
It's almost too much for Mike and Rochelle to absorb. But of particular importance to the parents is understanding why so many other doctors had such a hard time putting the pieces of the puzzle together.
So what you're getting is a picture of sort of a vague deterioration of the entire nervous system. It's not the only disorder that has that, and so that's part of what makes it really difficult to diagnose. It looks like a lot of other things.
And different things this little guy's had to go through, just by us guessing and hoping. I wish we could just take all those things away.
But while Mike and Rochelle finally have the answer they've been so desperately seeking, they do not have a cure. In fact, there is no known cure or even treatment for the disease.
It's a very, very devastating disease. He's wheelchair bound. He's very limited in his ability to communicate. He will continue that trajectory. Now, people don't die from developmental loss of milestones. They die in these disorders from some complication of neurologic impairment.
My biggest fear is that I'm not going to be able to live without him. That's mine. He's going to a better place, I know that, but and I just want him to be okay for as long as I can have him.
At least we're taking a step in the right direction. And I was so thankful for that. You don't feel like you're just lost out at sea on a piece of driftwood.
I remember Dr. Hayflick saying to me, if there's any hope I can have you hold on to, it's the fact that they're trying really hard for interventions.
Before the gene discovery, we didn't know that this profile that Zachary shows is part of the same disease spectrum. My hope is within the next 3 to 5 years, we can understand enough to start to target stages of the disease.
And I walked away with that. And it may not be in Zach's lifetime, but at least they're working on it and it's not a mystery anymore.
More than 30 years suffering from unpredictable and crippling attacks of diarrhea, vomiting, and bizarre swellings, Janet Long may be on the verge of discovering exactly what's causing her mysterious constellation of symptoms.
When Janet told me about the swelling, it was my eureka moment. The swelling symptoms suggested that it's not just a stomach problem anymore. It sounds like it's involving the immune system. And I now had a way to try to look for that.
And a seemingly simple blood test could be all it takes to put a name to Janet's long nightmare.
The blood tests were directed at a condition where you're missing a very special protein in your body called C1 esterase inhibitor that has profound effects on the immune system. And when you don't have that, you can get swelling everywhere. We decided she would get blood work done, and that would be the very key to making the diagnosis.
They took the blood, and I remember driving home and thinking, wow, I may really actually know now what's wrong with me.
A few weeks later, when the blood test results finally come in, Dr. Wolf confirms her suspicion.
I had really amazing results. We now had the diagnosis. It was angioedema.
Hereditary angioedema, or HAE, is characterized by a deficiency of C1 inhibitor.
In fact, the C1 esterase inhibitor was less than half the lower limits of normal.
Normal C1 inhibitor circulates in the blood and controls inflammation, the body's way of protecting itself from harmful bacteria and viruses. But in patients like Janet, the deficient C1 inhibitor activates inflammation even when there are no invading substances to fight off. Her body, in essence, attacks itself, triggering random bouts of edema or swelling.
Her bowel is swelling up, so she was having diarrhea also. She's getting pain, and she's vomiting, and then all of a sudden it goes away. The condition occurs in many ways in many different people, and it can be so fast that in some of these people can actually cause trouble breathing, and some people have died from problems breathing because of the quickness of onset.
While doctors don't know exactly what triggers the disease, they do speculate that hormonal changes have an effect, which explains why Janet's attacks started when she got her first period.
All of her symptoms were explainable by this condition. Pregnancy, which changes your whole body, can sometimes be a trigger for this.
It is almost impossible to predict how HAE will affect a woman during pregnancy. While some women report a reprieve in the attacks, others describe an onslaught of painful episodes. This explains Janet's radically different experiences between her first and second 2 pregnancies.
It was an incredible experience for me because that explains all these different things that had happened. I could say, okay, that makes sense.
After living with the debilitating and seemingly unexplainable symptoms for more than 30 years, Janet is completely overwhelmed by what she's hearing.
It's hard to describe, but it was such a revelation to me.
When Jan got her diagnosis, it was a time of elation around the house. We were all really excited.
There is no cure for HAE, but as a long-term preventative treatment, Janet is immediately put on an anabolic steroid to help control the random attacks of inflammation.
I can remember sitting in the bathroom shortly after I started medication thinking, wow, this is what it feels like to be without pain. That was really life-changing for me.
Now that she finally has her life back, Janet can't help but wonder why it took more than 30 years to find a doctor who could give her a solid diagnosis.
Janet was the first angioedema patient I had come across. These are rare conditions that you read about in medical school, and most people don't think of sending off the blood tests that would make the diagnosis.
In fact, HAE is so rare that as few as 1 in 50,000 people may have it worldwide. While Janet is thrilled to finally have the answer she's been desperately looking for, Dr. Wolf informs her that the case isn't closed yet.
Angioedema is often a hereditary condition, and therefore it was important that Janet have her children tested for angioedema.
When it turned out that Jenna also inherited the disease, I was happy to think that at least she would have a mom who knew what was going on with her, and I could then help her.
Diagnosis was very important to my mom. It was very important to her to know what was wrong with me because then she could protect me from it in the future.
Today, Zach West is 8 years old. While he'll continue to lose muscle control and eventually his ability to talk, Rochelle and Mike are thankful for every day they have together. Their priority now is living each day to the fullest.
I won't have any regrets when it's time to go because we've done everything we can for him. And we still will continue to do that. Most of all, we're just having fun. We're trying to live life and have fun, and we send him to school because his friends love him there.
They have made a tremendous effort to keep Zach active and enjoying things in life. He's just an amazing little boy, and she's an amazing mom.
We just try to take day by day. Then again, I looked at Zach, and he's doing really well for having it, so I'm just thankful for that.
Today, Janet is an outspoken advocate for HAE research and has even testified before the FDA in support of better treatments.
Information is power, so I would tell people who are still struggling, still searching, to not give up. It took me hundreds of doctors and 40 years, but because I went to that one last visit and tried one more time, I was able to find an answer.